My name is Ray.
Hi, this is Michael.
Welcome to our episode of Ray's Economics Clue Book. Today we talk about market structures and going on to monopolies.
Okay.
So basically, monopolies happen, obviously monopolies when there's only one firm in an industry, dominating an industry, theoretically. And it happens because there are barriers to entry. Because monopolies create profit. And that would entice other people to join the industry if there were not barriers blocking additional competitors in the industry. So there are a lot of types of barriers that combine to help form monopoly industries. One is brand loyalty. This is what, for instance, consumers are attached to existing products like Nike, Coca-Cola. Those are all very powerful brands that people usually have loyalties to. Economies of scale. For instance, we talked about this in our last few videos. Economies of scale, basically, when we, in the long run, with average fixed costs being variable, if we produce more, then our average total cost in the long run actually decreases. And so we have an economy of scale where it is more productive to, where if you're already large enough for producing a large amount, you have lower costs. But when you're just entering the industry, your average total costs are actually higher than a firm that's actually larger than you and been there for a while. Because they're on an economy of scale. So producing more for them or being larger as a corporation or as a firm is actually more efficient for them. And so this benefits the existing firms and bars new firms that face existing
the old AT&T, for example.
Face large startup costs. Geographical barriers is kind of similar to economy of scale, where no accessible suitable locations to prevent new entries, where you can't access a new location for resources or can't access a new location because of geographical barrier.
Like a scarce resource, like rare earth controlled by China. Almost 95% of rare earth is from China, for example. So.
Being the first mover, or mainly in technology, tech superiority, basically, like Facebook, Google, they were mainly the first popular or first widespread brand in the respective technological niche, and so thus they are very tough to beat because in some respects they also have a version of brand loyalty as well.
Absolutely,
Patents, government create barriers. Basically, patents, you own your intellectual property. We see this a lot in pharmaceutical industries, for instance. Vertical integration. You have access to complete chain of supply, leading to overproduction of final product. We see maybe historically like at Andrew Carnegie and his steel production. Carnegie steel production, he controlled all the supply and production of steel throughout the entire production process. He owned the entire process, basically.
Or today is like De Beers, right? The diamond from South Africa.
So monopolies, monopolies face a dilemma when it comes to demand, because they control the industry, they are the industry. And so all the demand goes to them. However, their demand is not just on the surface level the same as the market demand. Because even though they are an industry, they are also an individual firm that faces marginal revenue differences. And so what happens is the demand curve usually equates to price equals A is the intercept, minus BQ. Negative B is obviously the slope for a demand curve, as price decreases, quantity demanded increases, and Q is obviously the quantity demanded or quantity produced in the market, in the industry. And so we also have something, but the individual monopolies firms' marginal revenue curve is not the same as demand curve. It's actually a separate marginal revenue curve where the slope is double the negative slope of the existing demand curve. There's negative 2B instead of just negative B.
It's twice as steep as the demand curve. Actually, it's very easy to derive that from the marginal revenue definition, right? The marginal revenue definition is total revenue delivered to Q, right? When the Q equals,
which leads into A minus 2BQ, some very basic
exactly, because you can easily find the total revenue because there's no price discrimination. All the customers face the same price, right? So the total revenue is pretty simple. It's P times Q. Okay, so it's AQ minus BQ squared. Very simple calculus knowledge will tell you that actually the derivative of this total revenue to Q is A minus 2BQ. So it's pretty straightforward. You can see with basic algebra, geometry, and calculus knowledge, you can see actually the marginal revenue is A minus 2BQ. So basically it's a same intercept, just twice steep.
Original revenue equals AQ minus BQ squared. And so we would do derivative on that based off of Q, it basically turns into A minus 2BQ.
Yeah, so as Ray just explained, right? So yeah, it's pretty simple.
The reason we have a separate marginal revenue curve from our demand curve is because for monopolies, since they control the industry completely, in order to increase the quantity sold of their product, they have to decrease price.
Yeah.
So, if, for instance, if you want to increase production from, let's say, 500,000 units to 1 million units, you have to decrease price by a certain amount because in the demand curve's equation, P equals A minus BQ, A and B are constants.
Yeah.
So P and Q are inversely proportional.
Sure.
So in order to increase Q, you have to decrease P and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so this is why we have a separate marginal revenue curve for the monopolist firm instead of having the demand curve equal to marginal revenue as it is for a perfectly competitive firm.
Yeah, and assuming there is no price discrimination.
And we see here the marginal revenue curve
equals 0.
When it equals 0. At that same corresponding production point at the demand curve, that's midway. That's always midway or halfway through the demand curve.
Yes.
And so that's as we know from learning from previous videos, that is when it is unitary elastic, or when basically price elasticity of demand.
Yeah. PEOD. Yeah. We actually discussed the PEOD for last few slides, last few episodes. If you guys still remember, the PEOD, when the PEOD equals 1, it actually means the quantity effect cancels the price effect, right?
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, for the first half part of the demand curve, we have elastic, which means epsilon greater than 1.
Yeah.
And in the middle point is epsilon equals 1, PEOD equals 1. And in the latter half, it's epsilon less than 1. So that calls inelastic.
Yeah. So basically, right before demand becomes relatively inelastic, your marginal revenue hits 0, and then after that it becomes negative.
Yes. Okay.
Which makes sense.
Yes.
So for monopolies profit, basically monopolies, a perfectly competitive firm we learned makes normal economic profit in the long run. They make zero economic profit in the long run.
Yeah.
A monopoly is different. They make positive economic profit in the long run, and of course probably in the short run as well, barring different circumstances. But in the long run, we see here, since there's a difference between demand curve, which determines price, and their own personal marginal revenue curve for the individual monopoly, because there's a difference between the two curves, that difference becomes our source of positive revenue, and that positive revenue subtracted from our average total cost at that production point, or average cost of production point, that becomes our profit.
Yeah.
So what happens here is basically at a production point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Remember, for all firms, marginal cost equaling marginal revenue is where our production point meets.
That's an intersection. Intersection.
So this is our production point right here, where marginal cost meets marginal revenue. And so since demand is willing to pay up at price P, that is what the monopolists will sell at right here.
Yeah.
However, the marginal revenue curve for the firm is only right here, and the average total cost at that production point is where the average total cost curve hits the
ATC.
Is right here.
Yep.
And so we see here, there's a difference here between the price per unit sold and the average total cost at that production point, and that difference becomes our profit multiplied by our total amount of quantity sold. This rectangle right here is our profit.
The economic profit. So that means different from the perfect competition, our monopoly company enjoys a positive economic profit.
Yes. And we see here in perfect competition, we will probably produce at where demand meets our marginal cost, because in a perfect competitive firm, demand is our marginal revenue. So we do not have to suffer the same dilemma of lowering prices to increase quantity that a monopoly firm faces, because a monopoly is a price maker, not a price taker.
Yes.
And so because
that's very important.
Because they are a price maker, they have to, in order to, they can affect the price, and because they can affect price or decrease price to their liking, that also affects the overall, as a result, the overall quantity produced and sold in a market. And so because of that, in monopoly, since in a perfectly competitive firm, we would produce at about this point, but in a monopoly we produce at about this point. So see here, this difference right here is our difference between a perfectly competitive industry and a monopoly industry in terms of production.
Yeah, well, we're going to actually discuss that in the next episode anyway.
So for final conclusion, monopoly's marginal revenue demand curve are related, but unlike a perfectly competitive firm, they're not the same because a monopoly is a price maker, not a price taker. The marginal revenue is twice as steep as demand curve in terms of slope without price discrimination, which we'll talk about next video. Marginal revenue equals 0 means that when marginal revenue equals 0 at that corresponding production point on the demand curve, price elasticity of demand equals 1, which is because it's the middle of the demand curve.
Yeah.
And after that, price elasticity is relatively inelastic, which will cause the price maker, it will cause a monopoly to have negative marginal revenue. A monopoly usually results in economic profit in both the short and long run, but this implies inefficiency in the loss of total economic surplus because we see here in a perfectly competitive firm, they would produce more in terms of quantity.
Yes, and we actually will discuss more about why this is inefficient in the next episode.
So, thank you.
Thank you. See you next time. Bye-bye.